Okay, so then for Roman numeral 3, we're going to apply this method of using a synthetic chart to the book of Galatians for an example for you. Now, when you choose, I hope none of you can choose the book of Galatians for your synthetic chart because it's mine. Well, not really, but we're gonna use that as an example, so you can't use that for your project. I think that's understandable. So in step 1, we're going to determine the paragraphs of the book of Galatians. Now I'm just giving you an example and list these things off. If you were to do the book of Galatians, you very well would come up with something different. But it couldn't be too far different because mine is the actual inspired version of this. So, paragraphs that we're going to see in step 1, we've determined, or I determined in my 4th reading, was in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and then chapter 1, verses 6 through 10, then 1:11 through 17, 1:18 through 24, 2:1 through 10, 2:11 through 14, 2:15 to 16, 2:17 to 20, 2:21. Then chapter 3, 1 through 5, 3, 6 through 9, 3, 10 through 14, 3, 15 through 18, 3, 19 through 22, 3, 23 to 29, 4, 1 through 7, 4, 8 through 11, 4, 12 through 20, 4:21 through 5:1, 5:2 to 12, 5:13 through 15, 5:16 through 26, 6:1 through 10, 6:11 to 16, 6:17, and 6:18. So those are the paragraph divisions that I had determined, and actually I have some subdividing there, or I grouped them. I think maybe I couldn't determine whether they should be separate or not, but I grouped them together, but for later study. So then the step 2, we're going to summarize those paragraphs. So here are the summaries that I have determined, and of course this is the fruit of some thought. I didn't just I'm not able to just come up with this stuff myself, but I worked it through and then probably made some adjustments. It's very good when you do this to use a pencil, especially if you're doing it right on your chart. If you're using scratch paper, you can scratch out and rewrite and then transfer your final work into the chart carefully. But either way, these are the titles. So if you go back to chapter 1, verse 1 through 5, I said that was the salutation. Then verses 6 through 10 was Paul's thesis. In verses 11 through 17, we see Paul at conversion. 18 through 24, Paul in conference. And then chapter 2, 1 through 10, Paul at the council. 2:11 through 14 is Paul's rebuke. 2:15 through 16 is Paul's premise. 2:17 through 20, Paul's condition. 2:21, Paul's practice. 3:1 through 5 is the Galatians' foolishness. 3:6 through 9, Abraham's faith. 3:10 through 14, Abraham's blessing. 3:15 through 18, Abraham's inheritance. 3:19 through 22, the purpose of the law. 3:23 to 29, position of the law. 4:1 through 7, adoption of sons. 4:8 through 11, apostasy of sons. 4:12 through 20, appeal to sons. And 4:21 through 5:1, allegory of sons. 5:2 through 12, profiting in Christ. 5:13 through 15, loving in the church. 5:16 through 26, walking in the Spirit. 6:1 through 10, reaping in the household. 6:11 through 16, the epilogue. Verse 17, the postscript. And 6:18, the benediction. So that is the summary, summarizing the paragraphs. Now in step 3, we determine the subdivisions, and we determine them and title them. So we're going to see how the subdivisions are grouped, or how the paragraphs are grouped into subdivisions, and label them. So I don't have a subdivision for the first 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph is a salutation, and then the next one is a thesis. I don't have a subdivision for that. But then I see that chapter 1, verse 11 through 2:10 seems to be grouped around the gospel. And so I've subdivided that and titled it Paul's Gospel. Then, chapter 2, verse 11 through 2:21, I call Paul's apology. Apology using the idea of an apologetic. Then, in chapter 3, verse 1, all the way through 3, verse 18, I see him talking about before the law. He's talking about the Galatians' foolishness and Abraham, and obviously Abraham was before the law. And then chapter 3:19 through 3:29, he's talking about the law. And then 4:1 through 5:1 is after the law. And then the last group, 5:2 all the way through 6:10, is spiritual life. And then I don't have a subdivision for the epilogue, the postscript, and the benediction. Now, I just think of this. Not every book is going to have a salutation, a thesis, an epilogue, a postscript, and a benediction. But at the beginning and ends of books, sometimes there are features that are not really part of they're very important. They wouldn't be there if they weren't, if we didn't need them, but they're not completely connected to what's going on within the book. So you're free to, within realm or within reason, add things at the beginning and end that make sense in a literary sense to give yourself a good view of the book. So we've determined the paragraphs and summarized them. We've determined the subdivisions and titled those. And then, step 5 or 4, however we're counting, is to determine the major divisions. And so in the major divisions, I group the first 2 subdivisions together, Paul's Gospel and Paul's Apology, as I call that the Gospel, or historical. I have parallel major divisions, but the Gospel, parenthesis, historical. Then chapter 3 all the way through to chapter 5, verse 1. 3:1 to 5:1 I call the law, and that's doctrinal. And then chapter 5:2 to the end is the epistle, and that's practical. Of course, all of it is a letter, but it just seemed a nice parallel progression with those major points, and we have the historical there, doctrinal and practical, or the gospel, the law, and the epistle. Those are the major divisions. And then we want to come to the, in step 6, we note any special features. And so we could see that near the beginning of the book, Paul speaks of his own history or his biography, his gospel, his apostleship. Close to around chapter 3, the idea of justification comes up. At the point when I put this together, I determined that the key verse was chapter 3, verse 3. Somewhere around chapter 4, we see the idea of adoption. We see Jerusalem below and Jerusalem above in chapter 4, 25 and 26. We see the fruit of the Spirit there in chapter 5. Those are some major themes. And then some other prominent features. We have the double anathema in chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. There are some appointed times, chapter 1, verse 15, and chapter 4, 4. There's no distinctions in Christ, chapter 3, 26 to 28. We see the conversion of the Galatians in 4, 12 through 20. And we see the circumcisers addressed and talked about in chapter 5, 12, and 6, 13. So those prominent features go in that bottom list. Finally, we title the book, and this, of course, is the book of Galatians, and the central theme that I used as I developed these thoughts when I did this study was grace versus law.